And if you think about fossil fuel phase outs, there's no point getting a country with low fossil fuels to say we will phase out, right? If you don't produce or buy a lot of fossil fuels, of course you're happy with phase outs. You have to talk to the countries that are economically dependent on digging the stuff out of the ground, selling it around the world, or burning it. And if those countries cause some debate or challenges around how you're going to do that, then that's exactly where we need to be. So I think that kind of the idea of a petrol state trying to facilitate negotiations on fossil fuels is a good reflection, unfortunately, of the challenges of that discussion. And if any country is going to be able to facilitate that conversation over the next couple of years, but also here, we're looking at maybe a COP in the UAE, maybe a COP in Brazil, maybe a COP in Turkey or Australia, maybe a COP in Azerbaijan over the next 4 years. All of those countries are incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, both for domestic use and exports. All of those countries, you could argue, are fossil fuel states.
So I'm just arriving at the blue zone of the Expo City Dubai, where COP28 is taking place. Today is December 6th. It's the 7th day of COP. We're coming to the end of the first week. To enter the venue, we all actually have to go through a security check. It's a little bit like an airport security check, with the whole taking your laptop out and having your things going through the x-ray machine, walking through the metal detector door. As I walk here, there are also delegates and journalists from all over the world.
Hi everyone, I'm Magnani, Brazilian journalist and OptOut's climate editor. Late last year, I was at COP28, the UN's yearly climate conference, which took place in Dubai between November 30th and December 12th. The event gathered around 190 countries to debate solutions for the climate crisis. For the first time since the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015 and taken effect in 2016, the countries also produced and signed the Global Stocktake, a balance of all that has been done since the Paris Agreement to evaluate whether we have advanced enough as a planet in the fight against climate change. Every year, COP's host country gets to choose the event's president, someone who has a key role in getting all the parties to a consensus on the next steps. The United Arab Emirates elected Sultan Al Jaber, a government minister and the CEO of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. The choice was controversial, and throughout the event, Al Jaber was involved in scandals, as it was leaked that the UAE intended to use COP28 to strike oil and gas deals. And as The Guardian revealed, he had claimed that there was no science behind the demands for phasing out of fossil fuels. However, the president kicked off COP28 on a very high note, as he gavelled the agreement to operationalize the Loss and Damage Fund on the very first day of the event.
I invite the COP to turn to agenda item 7, also international mechanism for loss and damage associated with climate change impacts. The COP is invited to consider the matter of its authority over and guidance to the WIM, including its executive committee.
يبدأ المؤتمر الصحفي لرئيس COP28 سعادة الدكتور الجابر في الساعة 8 بعد الظهر في غرفة المؤتمرات الصحفية 1.
I'm now leaving the media center on my way to meet with Sophie. We're going to grab some coffee and talk a little bit about what she's been covering, a little bit about how she feels about the negotiations so far, what she has seen.
Sophie Davis is a Barcelona-based journalist and editor at OptOut network outlet Gas Outlook, an independent publication launched by Global Strategic Communication Councils, GSCC, which is focused on the global green energy transition. Hey! How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, and you?
Good, yeah. It's great being here. Like, it's been so nice. Like, just like that sense of kind of collective action over it, because, you know, like Gas Out looks quite small and, you know, like we're all spread out all over the world. So it's just nice to kind of like actually feel like it's a.
To me, it has been really an interesting experience because as a freelancer, I have never actually worked in a newsroom before.
Yeah.
And so, like, the media center kind of feels like a newsroom, especially because I'm
true.
here with the Climate Tracker team.
Yeah.
And so, you know.
Yeah, that's nice. Yeah, that's nice.
It's good.
But, you know, we're focused like on a very specific area for Gas Outlook. I'll talk a bit about that. So, you know, we're just looking at COP's progress with oil and gas, phasing out oil and gas production and cutting back on methane emissions. And, like, you know, there was the big announcements, like the flurry of exciting sounding announcements in the first couple of days. Like the oil and gas charter, decarbonisation charter that was announced on Saturday. Then you had like the cooling pledge yesterday over refrigeration, and there's been some announcements that on the surface sounded like they were a big deal, but like in fact they kind of lack substance a little bit. Like the oil and gas charter, it's non-binding, it's not legally binding. So it's voluntary, so a lot of people are criticising it, saying that it's probably not going far enough. On the other hand, you know, it is progress because like a lot of national oil companies like Aramco signed up to it, and ADNOC obviously agreed as well. So like typically those NOCs wouldn't want to be part of the agreement, so that's good that they're joining. But like so far the agreements on oil and gas aren't really going far enough. So hopefully like over the next week we're going to get some more substantial announcements coming out. Just now I went along to, there was a press conference given by UNFCCC, and it's Simon Steele giving an update on the progress with the talks, which was interesting because obviously as a journalist here we get to go to all the sort of secondary sessions and meetings that are happening, but we're not actually party to the formal discussions that are happening, the actual meetings where things are being decided and discussed. And he was saying, he basically just reiterated that we need to move towards a global phase out of fossil fuels, and that we can't let, you know, the messaging that comes out of COP be confusing as to like the Paris Agreement goals. But I've heard that message a lot in the last couple of days. And I went yesterday to a session where it was BOGA, the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, announcing that they've got 3 new members: Spain, Kenya, and Samoa. And Spanish Environment Minister Teresa Rivera was there, and she was saying similar things about, you know, how the time is now to moving towards more ambitious climate goals, and how, you know, we can't kind of lose our momentum in moving to the negotiations towards like a fossil fuel phase out. And I've heard that kind of message a lot from people. I think obviously there's a lot of concern among the high-level ministers over what's been happening the last week or so, with Al-Jaber's comments over like questioning the science behind fossil fuel phase out. And I'm sure that was pretty shocking for actually like most people that are attending COP actually.
Why do you think this was shocking though?
Possibly, I think a lot of people probably were suspicious that UAE wouldn't be on board with phasing out fossil fuels, or they had concerns that wouldn't be the case. You know, obviously because Al-Jaber's also CEO of ADNOC, the national oil company here. There was obviously a lot of criticism of the choice of him as president of COP28. However, I think probably people thought that he would like know better than actually talking at COP28 about questioning the science of fossil fuel phase out. Do you know what I mean? Like they probably expected that he would be able to keep his private thoughts to himself, if that's what he thinks. But so it's surprising that he almost had the gumption to question the science behind phasing out fossil fuels at the world's biggest climate talks.
But it did say that this actually happened on the 21st of November, right?
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, I mean, I guess.
I mean,
It wasn't planned by the UAE's presidency of COP28 to come out now. But at the same time, you'd maybe think that he wouldn't have said that in late November, a week or so before COP was starting, right?
But I also think that, like, not only that, but the fact that we have over 2,400 oil lobbyists, right, in this COP. So I think that, I think we were expecting to be more a push for using the words, like the expression phase down, right, rather than phase out.
Yeah.
They added the word phase, like the expression phasing out yesterday, right, to the draft of the GST.
Yeah. Yeah, finally, I guess some people were relieved about that. I mean, I guess they probably had to, right? The pressure was probably too great for them not to do that.
Well, before we go our separate ways, I just wanted to hear from you. What has been the highlight of being here at COP so far for you?
Good question. I think for me, because my coverage is highly specific for Gas Outlook. It's the energy transition of oil and gas companies, and it's interesting, and I don't know. This is maybe not a highlight. This is maybe a negative, but to see that in some ways that's still being sidelined, right? At COPs, you'd think, given how massive how massively fossil fuels are contributing to climate change, that that would be like the main point of discussion at the UN climate talks. But in fact, I felt since I've been here as though there hasn't been enough talk about what oil and gas companies are doing. And so in a way that makes me feel good, I suppose, because I feel more satisfied that like what I'm doing on a day-to-day level with my job is useful, because there's still a gap there, and there's still a massive amount of work that still needs doing. So we're trying to plug really that gap between climate and fossil fuels, and it's still a huge gaping hole. And so I guess for me that's been the highlight, to see that like my work isn't done yet, you know.
Sophie, thank you so much.
It's really nice.
Thank you for joining me for coffee, and it's been so nice meeting you in person.
You, and good luck for next week that you're here as well.
Thank you so much. So I'm just passing through security now. My things have already gone through the X-ray, and as pretty much every day, I bipped when I was walking through the metal detector. Most likely because of my earrings and stuff like this that I usually wear a lot every day. At least today I'm not forgetting my computer behind, which I did a few days ago. It was not nice. Yeah. Hoy estoy grabando cosas para mi podcast.
Ay,
sí, incluso aquí ahora. Vas a estar en mi podcast. Sí, no, pues no, grabé en la llegada, ahí incluso allá adentro. So every morning when we arrive, we come straight to the media center, which is basically the house of all journalists who are here. We have, like, there are 2 cafes inside of here, at least. I don't know, hundreds of chairs, tables. You have plugs everywhere. I think this is the place with the best internet connection in the entire Blue Zone, probably. So right now, I'm starting to organize my stuff. Turning on my computer, getting all my chargers on. Okay, so yeah, starting to get ready for the day. You will also hear a lot of Spanish around me because I'm with a team of other Latin Americans. So I'll be surrounded by Spanish and English and, I don't know, possibly other languages as well as the day goes.
So in case you didn't know, the reason I'm here at COP28 today is because I got a fellowship from Climate Tracker. Climate Tracker is an organization for journalists around the world who are covering climate. And I'm here now talking to Chris Wright, who was the founder of Climate Tracker. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining me and for agreeing to this little chat.
No worries.
So first, I would like you to introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners, since they don't really know so much about you. So if you could tell me a little bit about your journey in climate communication and how Climate Tracker started.
Sure. So I actually went to my first UN climate talks in 2011. I was there as a researcher. I was analyzing REDD and deforestation kind of ideas and plans at the time. And it was over a decade ago, and those negotiations have gone forward, and I've forgotten most of the things I tried to research at the time. But when I got to the COP, one of the things that I noticed, I was working also as a freelance journalist in a couple of different outlets, and I really connected very well with a couple of other Australian journalists, a couple of UK journalists, a couple of journalists from the US. And I met kind of only a very small handful of journalists from outside of those English-speaking and kind of developed country backgrounds. But the few that I did meet, the COP was in Durban, so I got to meet some great African journalists, one Mexican journalist that became a very long-term friend. But the few that I did meet really kind of opened my eyes to the challenges of being a journalist from a developing country trying to cover this event. And then kind of over the years, I started to learn a little bit more about the challenges of being a climate journalist in many of those contexts in general, without a lot of university programs that combine science and journalism, without a lot of editors that understand and kind of can see the economic benefits of writing about climate, and without big audiences and kind of publications that are really trying to drive this forward and funding to do so. So over the next couple of years, I was basically kind of on a bit of a learning journey of trying to understand some of those blockages. And then kind of I slowly started getting more and more into journalism around the COPs. And then kind of joined a small program where I was trying to bring in bloggers actually from around the world to one particular COP event. And kind of from that, I then decided, I really want to start working more with journalists and not just kind of bloggers. And Twitter had just started, Facebook was kind of still a new thing before everyone started getting toxic on Facebook, and kind of digital media around these UN climate talks was a really kind of interesting new space to be in. But I was kind of also trying to merge that space with all of the incredible journalists that I thought weren't getting the same opportunity. So that's why in 2015 we kind of tried to go full on with this kind of Climate Tracker organization. And at the time it was, myself and a small handful of friends that were journalists I met along the way. And that's really expanded now to being an organization that's independently registered in 3 different regions around the world, and we've got kind of programs in countries that not a lot of other organizations have a lot of engagement in. And here at COP we've got about 15 in-person journalists and another 8 online journalists from all across Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Caribbean, and they're doing an incredible job. And it's really beautiful to see what I think is the next stage of that journey, which is those regions and those kind of regional hubs really running on their own and doing very independent things.
Thank you so much, Chris. And one thing, I am a little bit biased to talk about this, but I, as a climate journalist myself, but I feel that climate journalism has become increasingly more important around the world. And with your journey, you have certainly seen that, right? How this has grown. So I would like to ask you to tell me a little bit about what you have seen in terms of how how climate journalism has been growing in space, in importance, and even not only as a communication tool itself, but also in terms of everything we're seeing here at COP, how this interferes in processes of decision making and things like that, please.
Yeah, so when I was starting out, a lot of my heroes were some of the basically old white guys who were, Bill McKibbins, Andy Revkins, who were in these big international publications that I knew of, and really started writing books and kind of doing the New York Times, The Nation, all these, like The Guardian. John Vidal, for example, who was the editor of The Guardian, back when I started getting into this on the environment section. These were people who were either science journalists or were environmental journalists, and were just kind of running with this climate story, often without a lot of other people running with them. And I think that was what I might classify as like the first generation of climate journalists. You saw a couple of scientists starting to speak out about climate change in the 80s and the 90s, and there was only a handful of journalists who really picked that up and ran with it as a daily story. But what I learned when I started getting into this space is just how diverse that first generation of journalists looks around the world, and how different that kind of transition from, some environment journalism, some political journalism, some science journalism into climate reporting around the world looks. So I don't really know if I know what the global picture of how climate journalism started in, say, Bolivia versus like Bangladesh looks. But that's kind of what I saw, and what I've seen since is that the transition of climate journalism has gone alongside the transition of digital transformation in the media as well. So it's kind of, as well as this, I think a broader social understanding that different elements of media, but the world, are not so disconnected from each other. So I think I'm really excited now that more journalists are starting to connect things that are not science or environment stories with climate. You get a lot more political reporters who are jumping in. You get even sports reporters and fashion reporters who are talking about climate issues. But I still think that it's often seen as like a color piece rather than a kind of really central piece for a lot of publications around the world. I think every country's on a slightly different media journey, but I still think it's not so often that you see a publication who has elevated their science or climate reporting team to the same level as their political investigative teams and things like that. So I think we're still a while away from getting to that level, but there are incredible publications around the world. I mean, in Brazil, what both Folha and Globo have been doing over the last couple of years is I think, incredible. In Kenya, you've got the Nation publication. It's got a whole weekly climate kind of piece. You've got fellows from our journalism fellowships in the past who are now kind of the climate reporters in publications that didn't even have a climate section 2-3 years ago. So I think the transformations are happening really, really fast, and more publications are seeing that this is not just a one-off story, once a year, but a daily story that is really incredible and cross-cutting. But I think that kind of it's still being led by individual journalists pushing through kind of barriers, rather than lots of publications going, okay, what can we do across the publication, up and down and across our verticals to try to do this better. So that still concerns me, because an individual journalist pushing against things means that they can move to another publication, they can have changes in their life, they can move around, and if you lose those individual people, maybe an outlet or a country loses some of the best climate journalism they have. So I think it's a while away before it gets really, really sustainable, but I think we're in a faster pace of change than we've ever seen before.
Thank you so much, Chris. And yeah, this hearing you talk about this actually makes me really happy for the work we've been doing at OptOut, because we do gather over 200 independent media outlets from across North America. And one thing that I noticed as the climate editor, because one thing we do is that everything in our app is hand curated by journalists. So it's not, based on algorithm, it's really all of us getting, picking up the main stories of the day. And one thing I realized is that we actually do, of course, this is still North America, and this, unfortunately, doesn't, it's not reproduced in so many countries, especially in the global south. But I do see that we have, at least among our partners in independent media, more and more media outlets that are really focused on climate and environment. So yeah, so I'm really hoping for more of this movement that is not so much based on independent journalists, as you said.
Yeah, and North American space has been one of the kind of few media markets in the world where you've seen lots of different attempts to get lots of different publications working together on climate stories. Whether it was back during the Climate Desk days, whether it was covering climate now, whether it was just kind of big outlets sharing kind of insights and investigative stories. You see it a little bit in the UK and across Europe as well, but I think kind of a lot of that cross-publication experimentation has really kind of bubbled up in the US in particular. But I think kind of one of the challenges is that, you know, in the past I've looked at some of that and thought, okay, it's worked here, let's try to do it somewhere else. And when you try to replicate it, you find all these other complications and challenges. Language diversity, different competitive environments, different kind of types of collaborations and things like that. So
I
even
find financing, right?
Yeah, of course, financing. Yeah,
that's a big issue for a lot of global south countries as well.
Oh yeah, and a big part of what, you know, Climate Tracker has always tried to do is find and advocate for kind of better support for journalists, for publications, for editors, just to run individual stories, let alone to run their newsrooms, let alone to kind of make transformations in their newsrooms. So in the US, a big reason why a lot of this experimentation has happened is because there's been people willing to experiment with their funding across media outlets. And we've seen a lot of really positive results. And we just don't see that amount of generosity and that willingness to experiment in other markets. And so you see a lot of centralization of money in a few organizations, and you see kind of a lot of outlets out there just going, yeah, we'd like to write climate stories, but like, who's going to pay for that? Because we just don't, you know, they need a runway before it becomes popular, and they need to like build up a team of journalists to make these stories great, rather than just saying, oh, that one person can do one story every now and then.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, Chris, now one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because you have been following COPs, as you said, since 2011. So I wanted to hear a little bit from you about how these events have changed over this past decade.
The last decade? So from 2014, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, let's say the last decade and a half, so to speak, like, since you started accompanying them.
It's a great memory, because I actually just chatted with a journalist from Peru trying to cover the Peruvian delegation here, and it's like a tiny delegation, they're barely engaging, and a lot has changed in Peru since 2014 when the COP was hosted in Lima, which was really the first COP that we saw a US-China alliance really shift things in preparation and shifting the momentum in preparation for the Paris Agreement. And that was the first time the countries voluntarily came up with their NDCs as well. What we've seen since then is, I think, a really incredible pace of change if you compare it to the previous decades. So 2004 to 2014, now to 2024. It's just become much more well understood that every country is getting involved in different ways, and that it's not this kind of, we're going to sit and wait for one or two countries to do something before everything else moves. There's much more clarity around 1.5. There's much more clarity around talking about the fossil fuel contributions to 1.5. You know, even 5 years ago, there wasn't even a mention of a fossil fuel element in any final text. And, Glasgow was the first COP, COP26, where coal was specifically identified. And then last year, obviously, there was a reinforcement of that, but kind of a debate around fossil fuel phase out that kind of intensified again. Now, the reporting on that said that was a failure because they didn't get a fossil fuel phase out there. And here, you've kind of basically had that debate since day one, whereas last year it was only a debate on the last 48 hours. So I think seeing it as a process, you can see incredible progress in the process and in the kind of international recognition now, not just that there is a goal, that there is kind of a collective need to get around this goal and to kind of start coming up with different ways in which countries can contribute towards 2050. But now we're really diving down into like the real elephant in the room, which is like, okay, so this comes from burning stuff. Who's going to stop burning stuff, and how are we going to stop burning the stuff like collectively? And I think that's really, if on a 10-year perspective, you can really see some incredible progress. The challenge is there's not a scientist in the world who says, great, so at this rate of change, in another 10 years, we might be really nailing down exactly how much fossil fuels each country can use. So the challenge is that you're trying to do a pretty unheralded thing, which is get countries around the world to talk about their economies and transforming their economies in a way that's ecologically more sound, with no really like global police to enforce it. And you're trying to do that on a deadline that isn't exactly just recognizing how difficult that politics is and going, okay, I'll give you another 10 years to like chill out and figure that out. Like, I recognize it's hard.
Since you have been looking so closely into the negotiations, I wanted to get your opinion in general about how you feel we're doing this year.
So once we get down to the negotiations, like, it's the same types of conversations, and it's about the people in the room. Now, how has that gone the last couple of weeks? Well, a lot of people got here thinking that there's no chance that a petrol state, if you want to call it, or a country that gets most of its income from fossil fuels can facilitate a process like this. To be honest, from negotiators, I don't know if there's been a continuous criticism like there was fears going into it. I think there's actually been a sense that broadly the negotiations have been facilitated quite well for what they are. Remember, this is a geopolitical process with 190 different contributors from around the world, and like, you can facilitate it in one way or the other, but at the end of the day, it's those countries that get to basically, you know, play out political games, and that's what dictates things. So I think that, you know, the UAE has done all right so far, and I think that the way that they've tried to influence the talks in structuring things in certain ways, trying to kind of move things along in different directions, has actually been, you know, surprisingly quite well done. And I think that if you compare this to last year, or if you compare this to kind of previous years, it would be hard to find too many other processes where you could really point the finger and say, this is bad, this is bad. So I'd be really interested to see how journalists report on the overall reflections over the next couple of days. In terms of the kind of the fossil fuel discussions and such, well, you know, I remember watching a documentary a couple of years ago by Slavoj Žižek, who's a philosopher who kind of is batshit crazy, basically. But he's kind of interesting, and he was pointing at a waste recycling center and comparing that to a forest. And he says, you know, environmentalists often put themselves in the forest and want to protect this, and they don't spend enough time in the rubbish dumps and trying to fix this. And I think what he was trying to say is that, you know, you can't just try to protect the good things and lull on the good progress. You need to actually dive into the things that are going badly and try to kind of see how to fix those problems. And if you think about fossil fuel phase outs, there's no point getting a country with low fossil fuels to say we will phase out, right? If you don't produce or buy a lot of fossil fuels, of course you're happy with phase outs. You have to talk to the countries that are economically dependent on digging the stuff out of the ground, selling it around the world, or burning it. And if those countries cause some debate or challenges around how you're going to do that, then that's exactly where we need to be. So I think that kind of the idea of a petrol state trying to facilitate negotiations on fossil fuels is a good reflection, unfortunately, of the challenges of that discussion. And if any country is going to be able to facilitate that conversation over the next couple of years, but also here, you know, we're looking at maybe a COP in the UAE, maybe a COP in Brazil, maybe a COP in Turkey or Australia, maybe a COP in Azerbaijan over the next 4 years. All of those countries are incredibly dependent on fossil fuels, both for domestic use and exports. All of those countries, you could argue, are fossil fuel states. And those are the countries who are going to be critical to finding a way to get agreement on fossil fuel phase down. So it was a massive risk coming here, and I think there's a lot of valid criticisms on the, you know, the influence of OPEC, fossil fuel lobbyists and things like that. But to be honest, if you're not making the people whose businesses are at risk worried, then you're probably not doing your job very well. And if you see OPEC coming out with letters saying block all the negotiations, we can't handle any of this, if you see fossil fuel lobbyists turning out in numbers, it means they're paying attention, which means that like this process must be doing something. So I'm kind of excited about something happening over the next 2 days. I know those countries, those lobbyists will do everything in their massively well-funded power to try to stop it. And we'll see what the balance is at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Chris. It really is interesting to see that these stakeholders are actually scared that something's happening, and seeing this as a good sign of what is going on here. So thank you so much for sharing this insight. And before we finish here, one thing I wanted was for you to tell me what has been a highlight for you of this COP so far.
I mean, I think kind of for me, COPs are always about the people here, and are always about kind of hearing new, interesting things that these people are trying. And whether it's in journalism, whether it's the NGOs here, whether it's different country negotiators that I've met, I've just kind of heard all of these different things that people are going to try out next year that are really quite inspiring. And I think that, that's one of the slight, I think, kind of benefits of all of the carbon that's burned to get everyone here. That it is a really dynamic space, and it has become and is really the kind of the experimentation ground of the world's environmental experts, NGOs, journalists. They get here, they learn from each other, they go back, they try things out, and for those committed to the circus every year, they come back and they tell everyone what they tried. So that's always a highlight for me. I think that kind of the protest that happened yesterday had incredible representation from Amazonian indigenous peoples who are, by far and away some of the most incredibly well-presented, well-dressed people in the world, and kind of to see them there and just have a thought towards, what that might look like in Belém in 2 years' time is absolutely incredible. So that was very exciting, as thinking about the future. But I think that, in the negotiations, we have rarely even talked about renewables in the past. And this year you've got 129 countries who've signed up to say we want to triple renewables and phase down fossil fuels at the same time. Now, if you look at that list, anyone who knows this process should look not at the people who signed up, but the countries who haven't signed up, right? But that is not to take away from the fact that we've got 130 countries who've said basically between now and 2030 they're going to ramp up investment in renewables, they're going to ramp up energy efficiency goals, and they're going to kind of really take a conscious effort on phasing down fossil fuels. Now, even if we don't get a text in the next 2 days, I think that's something that really can ignite action over the next couple of years. And what happens is when you start getting investment, when you start getting renewable energy built into these energy systems, it unlocks all these other things, and it unlocks all of these other opportunities that you just didn't see beforehand. So it's not going to be perfect everywhere, and there are going to be big issues about where that renewable energy is built, what it's built out of, and kind of how all of that ownership and kind of profit sharing goes. But
the transition really is just, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
And any investment, any infrastructure at a national level has massive amounts of politics involved. Talking about that at a global level, I mean, amplify that by 1,000. So, of course, how that gets done, how that gets built, how that gets integrated into existing politics and systems, that's where the rubber meets the road, no doubt. But what you get at these events is just the kind of the goalposts for the world. And it always matters what countries do back at home and how that plays out politically. But that's a pretty good goalpost to have. And it's a goalpost that these countries can come back on each year. Developing countries can be like, hey, what happened to that money that we're meant to get to invest in our renewables? Developed countries can be go back domestically and say, hey, when we want to roll out renewables, we're not just doing it alone. So don't give me these right-wing politicians who say that we're doing it all and China's doing nothing or something like that. So it's a really valuable global signal that can ignite a lot of things back home.
Thank you so much, Chris. Once again, thank you so much for everything you have been doing in the past almost a decade for journalists and climate journalists around the world. And thank you so much for being here and for talking to me in this podcast.
No worries. Great to be here, and you've been doing great reporting so far. So can't wait to see what happens in the next 2 days.
Thank you so much.
A lot happened during COP28, from the announcement of the Loss and Damage Fund to a treaty to triple renewable energy to pro-Palestine demonstrations. But while the event reached significant milestones, it also fell short in many aspects. Things that are common to all COPs, as journalists who have been covering the event for years can attest to. That is what Indian environment and science journalist Shrishan Venkatesh from Carbon Copy told me on the last day of the conference.
Okay, so yeah, we're here on the last day of COP, and I think that this is the
last
only
day.
well, last official day at least, right? And I think this is the only place that still has a lot of people.
Yeah, seems like it's typical.
Yeah.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah.
That the media is the last to leave. Media and the negotiators get the flights together.
It's good because then you can still interview your negotiations in the in the
Yeah,
plane.
actually, the airport is a great place to network post-COP.
Nice.
Yeah.
Good to know. Good to know. So, I first wanted to thank you for agreeing to talk to me, but I also wanted to ask you to introduce yourself a little bit
Okay.
to our listeners.
So thank you for having me on. My name is Srishan. I'm a journalist from India. I've been working on climate for about a decade now, and I manage a small newsroom from India that's very climate focused on perspectives from the global south. It's called Carbon Copy, and we do long form analytical work on different policies as well as just news events that are happening with somewhat of an analytical take, somewhat of a forward-looking take of what it would mean, what those developments mean. And I've been coming to COP since 2016, so post-Paris. Yeah.
So you have been to COPs in many different countries, right? And I wanted to hear a little bit from you what you think, like, what sets this COP apart from the other COPs you've been to?
Okay, there are a few things. Let me start with like the positives. Even though this venue is really large and it takes a lot of time to get from one end to another, which can be painful for the legs and quite a hassle, quite tiring. It's organized pretty well in terms of the meeting rooms and where things are situated. They're all situated together. Probably, the venue is among the better designed venues that I've seen. Yeah, in that sense. Although it's so big, and it's very very tiring by the end of the day. Now for the other things that set this COP apart, unfortunately those are not very flattering. I think the process during this COP has been particularly worrying in a way. The UNFCCC has a set way of doing things, a set way of negotiating documents, where you can imagine, like if you want consensus between 190, 200 countries, you need to get them in a room together, they need to go over the text together, they need to fight the things out together in that way. But that has not happened here, and you just have a process that feels like it lacks transparency in many ways. And I can see that this process has made a lot of countries feel like they haven't been kept in confidence, and that things have just mysteriously appeared in the text, and things that they would have never agreed on. And the way it usually works is a document, like a first initial draft is prepared, and then parties sit, and then they chalk down the red lines and what will absolutely not fly, what can be worked with. They will create in bracketed text that are provisional. They'll continue to kind of chisel it and tweak it and make it something that works for everyone. But this year we haven't had a single text. The text that we received yesterday that everyone has been running with, so everyone's been running with it because really we haven't received anything else. So, but what we received was not something that is workable as a whole. It doesn't make sense. There are too many contradictions. There are too many red lines, and you can sense from the reactions from not any single part of the world or single country or anything like that. But have you heard of anyone who's really happy with it?
Not really.
Yeah.
I mean, even Brazil, who is expanding fossil fuels right now, was still disappointed because the country still wanted to go for the word phasing out.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, in Brazil, it would have to be like phasing out for the rich countries so they could, be the most responsible. But yeah, still, I think like most people were very disappointed.
Yeah.
And
I can't blame Brazil for that stance, because the UNFCCC as well as the Paris Agreement is very clear in its provision that developed countries will take the lead in emission reductions. And we have had 2 periods of commitments before the Paris Agreement was signed, where emission reductions were asked of developed countries, and those were not met. So, for a lot of countries that haven't had a fair share of carbon space to develop, why are you going to do something when those that have overshot their fair share haven't done their bit? It's a contract, right? And contracts are built on trust. If you cannot build trust, then you can't build a contract. But Brazil's joining of the OPEC is very interesting. Very interesting. I believe they want to compensate for the oil production with the carbon stock held in the Amazon, something like that. Do the accounting through that. It's an interesting proposal. I don't know where it will land. So, yeah, do you want to talk about how the emissions are calculated?
yeah, sure, please.
That's an interesting one, because so for Brazil, as the territory where the oil and gas is extracted, the primary kind of emissions that they would have to report are the emissions that come from the production. The secondary kind is the emissions that come from the transport. And the third kind is the emissions that come from the burning, from the use of fossil fuels. And these are called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. For Brazil, they only have to worry about the Scope 1 emissions. The transport maybe, but not the use. The use is for the end place where the fossil fuels end up, and that's for their decarbonization strategy to handle. It's not something the oil and gas industry worries itself with. There are arguments, of course, that they should be worried about it and so on, and just tackling one side is not looking at the whole picture and things like that. But if it has to work all together, you also need to make sure that there isn't double accounting of something, or the inverse of it, that something happens and it's not accounted for at all. And from that perspective, it's really important to have like one piece that fits into another piece. That is the challenge of the UNFCCC.
Of course. And Trishan, one thing I wanted to ask you a little bit about, because I think I mentioned, right, that I've spoken to 2 other journalists who are from the Global North.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get a little bit more of a Global South perspective. So I wanted to hear from you what you think are the main issues. I think especially for countries like Brazil, India, China, that are countries in the Global South, but they are not the poorest countries, right? We have a lot of inequality, a lot of poverty, a huge population under the line of extreme poverty, hunger, all these situations. But we are also medium to mid-high income countries.
Yeah, we're G20 countries.
Exactly.
We have economic clout. That's true, absolutely. We're developing countries that are a part of G20. So we have some economic leverage and some economic clout. And there's no denying that. But I want to go back to the UNFCCC. I mentioned that one of the things in the UNFCCC is that developed countries should be taking the lead. That comes from the principles of the UNFCCC, which mandates equity and common but differentiated responsibilities according to the respective capabilities of different countries. And that is very, very important through this process. From the perspective of developing countries, most developing countries negotiate as a bloc, because that gives collective bargaining power. You can put stronger positions. So for Brazil, for example, Brazil is a part of several blocs. It's a part of ABU, which is Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay. It's just a 3-country bloc. It's a part of the G77, which is 100 and something country bloc. It's a part of LMDC, which is a 12-country bloc. So it's a part of BASIC, so that's a 5-country bloc. It's a part of several blocs, and it's its own country as well that can have its own position. For most countries, because of the way in which the UNFCCC is framed, that kind of differentiates between developed countries that come under the OECD and everyone else. The developing countries have to show solidarity with each other. It's not about what is only of what is interest to us. Sure, you're allowed to have your own national interest, but as a position, you generally align with the position of the global south, of the developing countries, of countries that might not be in the position that you are. You fight for them.
That?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course, absolutely. That's the only reason why we are 30 years in to this. Otherwise, multilateralism would have broken. If everyone was fighting for themselves. Sure, everyone has national interests, but there is an overarching understanding that in this battle, you have to show solidarity to those who cannot argue for themselves, who don't have the technical capacity to do it for themselves. You have to. And I understand that, we have cynicism about it and we see things from a certain perspective that, we want more ambition over here and it's not happening. And we might also use it to kind of use that solidarity to kind of give ourselves more leeway. But overall, it is the ones who have the weakest or the lowest technical capacity, the lowest ability to remain with the world, whose interests are also kept in the front. So if you look at the statements that are coming out, I'm pretty sure Brazil hasn't given too many statements on its own. Most of them are aligned with the G77. Most of them are aligned with LMDC or BASIC, because they understand that unless we as a part of the developing world who are catching up, who are in a place where we have to fight a colonial past, we have to fight previous injustices, all of these things, we have to stick together. We can't let the same thing repeat over and over and over again. It makes the whole process frustrating, slow, very stuck in many places, but that's the only way to do it. And I think the current text and how different countries or different negotiating blocks have been going about it is a perfect example.
Since you mentioned this, right, like this ultimate goal, which is
to
find justice for humanity, which sounds so amazing, and it's been so hard so far. I wanted to ask you how you feel this COP has been doing in terms of reaching the agreement, and because I don't know if you will agree with me, but I feel like in the beginning, like in the early days, we were a bit more optimistic. We were hearing a little bit more about phasing out entering text, and then it didn't really. So I wanted to hear from you.
Yeah, I don't want to sound like an old guy who's just been coming here all the time. But like the more you come to these places, the more you expect this. So this is a political space. Optics matters. The first thing that a presidency wants to do is to grasp the narrative, is to give it a positive feel, because that's what is plastered all over the place. So this time they got off to a great start. They adopted a decision on the first day. It's never happened before on loss and damage. They knew that a strong start will give it a good positive spin, and they also knew that the second part of it is going to be really tricky and really difficult to get through. And the second part of it is actually the flavor of the COP. So, they did the first part perfectly. Go in with the announcements, cluster all the good news. But for most of the people who are here, who have been here before, like a few times, they knew this is just a narrative play.
Yeah, well, that's not very hopeful. But I mean, I think it's important to be realistic as well, right? I think that even though this is not like the happiest note to end in, I think that it's still a realistic one, and it might actually also be a call for action. Right?
Absolutely.
So I think that
we will find a happy note to end on. This is the first time ever that there has been so much attention on fossil fuels. And I know that once that comes in, there's no going back. This is an incremental process. You will not get everything here, but you will achieve something. You cannot. It's the sounds around this are so strong that you cannot leave here without something that's strong on fossil fuels, something that's in some ways an equalizer for the world, and that's something to be happy about. It's okay. We won't get everything. The fight is a long fight. You come back next year, you do the same thing all over again, curse yourself, and be like, why am I here? Why do I have to do this? But this is the nature of the beast. There's no other way to do it. And you have to be happy for every bit of incremental progress because it adds, and you have to keep building on it.
Before we end, I wanted to hear from you, what have been the highlights of this COP for you personally? It can be something from the negotiations, it can be something in your experience.
I think the buildings have been the highlight for me, really. Like, apart from the process and the things that I spoke about, which are very like to do with this, I think the buildings around the venue are nothing like anything I've seen before at any venue. There's the weird building with the pipelines, there's like buildings that are completely made of solar panels, there's the dome in the middle that's like does an amazing sound and light show every evening. Like, those things I've never seen at any COP venue before. And that's been a little bit of a highlight, apart from the grit of the process itself and the frustrations of the process itself. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Prashant. This has been really fun talking to you and really informative, and thank you so much. And I'm sure our listeners are also going to be very happy listening to all of this.
It was a pleasure.
And yeah, good luck for us in these final hours.
Yeah. You better dig your heels in.
COP28 ended with the parties signing a text that spoke about transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. While this phrasing was weaker than the term phasing out of fossil fuels, which we all hoped for, it was the first time ever the event directly mentioned fossil fuels. Over the weeks that followed, many spoke of it as the beginning of the end of the fossil fuel era, which does sound a bit too optimistic. Meanwhile, COP29, which is set to take place this year in Azerbaijan, has already appointed a state oil company veteran as the event's president. Now, we'll have to wait and see.